In this video, I'll cover the topic of suicide. And the one thing I'll start out by saying about suicide is that we as clinicians are not very good at predicting it. And I think a good example of this is in the video that I'll link up here involving Chester Bennington, who was the lead singer of Linkin Park, who completed suicide this past year. And this was a person that you probably would not have suspected, and I don't think many people would have suspected this. But in this particular video, it's an interview that he did at a radio station where he talked a little bit about his depression. He talked a little bit about how his mind is a very dark place and that he has to stay out of his head in order to, essentially stay sane and not to think about things like suicide. So, again, interesting because we're not good at predicting it. Interesting because I think it's a good example of somebody that we would have never thought about necessarily completing suicide. Yet there were probably some signs and things in his interviews and his speech and obviously in his music as well that kind of pointed us in that direction that he might be at risk. So again, an interesting point with suicide. So suicide, a bunch of epidemiology and statistics about suicide. It's the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. Each year we have approximately 44,000 people complete suicide, and for each person who completes suicide, there's another 8 to 10 people who attempt. So that's a lot of people altogether. I mean, if you count not only the people who complete, but also those who attempt, it's a large, large number of people who have some kind, and that doesn't even count the people who just have suicidal thoughts or who have had thoughts of suicide. This is just people who have actually done something. Up to 50% of those who complete actually visit a primary care provider in the month prior. And what you see now at all primary care providers and offices, whether you go for your normal physical, your routine yearly physical, you'll see that they'll ask you questions about depression and they'll also ask you questions about suicide. So from this data, because we realized that a lot of people were visiting primary care providers the month prior, and of those people, a lot of them, more than half, were verbalizing thoughts of suicide during the visit to the primary care provider. So these people were actually basically telling the primary care provider, not only am I thinking about suicide, but I'm likely to complete. And essentially this information is now kind of translated into more screening and on the part of the primary care providers to look for these signs and symptoms. So obviously regular screening is going to be really, really important, and also regular screening for any other comorbid psychiatric disorders. So what they also found was 90% of patients who complete have at least one major psychiatric diagnosis. So not only do you want to be screening for suicidal thoughts or suicide attempts in the past, etc., you also want to be screening for other psychiatric disorders that may also be related. So 90% of those people had some kind of major psychiatric disorder. And in the next videos, I'll cover all the epidemiology and statistics and such, and I'll talk a little bit more about suicide.